The wind howled across the Montana high country at speeds that no one had instruments to measure accurately, but experienced trappers estimated it at 70 to 80 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick that a man standing 10 feet away was completely invisible, swallowed by white. The temperature read 44 degrees below zero on the few thermometers that hadn't frozen solid. It was March of 1892, and what would later be called the Great Whiteout had descended on the northern Rockies with apocalyptic fury. Storms this severe came perhaps once in a generation, and they killed. In the scattered cabins throughout the Tobacco Root Mountains, men huddled inside their shelters and listened to sounds that made their blood run cold. The groaning of timber under impossible stress, the crack of breaking support beams, the crash of roofs collapsing under snow loads that exceeded anything the builders had anticipated. 3 cabins within a 10-mile radius of each other collapsed during the first night of the storm, their roofs pancaking down onto the occupants. 2 men died instantly, crushed by falling logs and snow. A 3rd man escaped with broken legs, crawling through hip-deep snow to a neighbor's cabin, only to find that roof had also collapsed. He froze to death within sight of potential rescue. The storm lasted 4 days and 3 nights. When it finally broke on March 19th, the landscape had been transformed. Snow depths measured 6 to 8 feet on level ground. Drifts reached 20 feet or more. Trees were snapped like matchsticks. And of the 23 cabins in the region, 17 had suffered roof failures. Some were total collapses. Others were partial failures where sections of roof caved in. Only 6 cabins emerged with their roofs intact. Among those 6 was a cabin everyone had mocked for its strange, excessively slanted roof. The cabin belonged to a Norwegian trapper named Gustav Nordstrom, and his roof was so steep that when people first saw it, they laughed. They said it looked like a child's drawing of a cabin, with a roof pitch so extreme it seemed cartoonish. They said Gustav had wasted timber building a roof twice as tall as it needed to be. They said the steep angle would catch wind and rip the whole structure apart in the first serious storm. They said many things. Then the Great Whiteout came, and Gustav's ridiculous roof stood firm, while conventional roofs collapsed all around. Not a single beam cracked, not one support timber failed. The snow that crushed other cabins slid harmlessly off Gustav's steep slope, accumulating on the ground around the cabin but never loading the structure beyond its capacity. When neighbors dug out after the storm and made their way to Gustav's cabin, expecting to find another disaster, they found Gustav alive, warm, and his cabin completely intact. Standing inside, looking up at the massive timbers of the steep roof, one man asked the question everyone was thinking. "How did you know? How did you know to build like this when nobody else did?" Gustav looked at the roof he'd built, the roof everyone had called wasteful and foolish, and said simply, "Because in Norway, we have had 1,000 years to learn what snow can do to a roof. You have had 50 years. I built with 1,000 years of knowledge. You built with 50 years of hope." The story of Gustav Nordstrom's slanted roof is not just about one man surviving one storm. It's about the difference between building based on the worst you've seen and building based on the worst that's possible. It's about understanding snow loads, wind dynamics, and structural engineering in ways that frontier builders rarely did. And it's about why indigenous knowledge from places with extreme conditions often outperforms conventional wisdom from places with moderate conditions. Gustav's roof design, mocked as excessive and wasteful, turned out to be the only design that understood what winter in the Rockies could actually deliver. Gustav Nordstrom arrived in Montana Territory in 1885 at age 31. He'd grown up in the mountains of western Norway, in a region where winter snowfall measured in meters rather than feet, where snow stayed on the ground from October to May, where avalanches were a constant threat, and where buildings had evolved over centuries to survive conditions that would destroy typical frontier construction. His family had been farmers and builders for generations,
and Gustav had learned traditional Norwegian timber framing techniques from his father and grandfather. These techniques, developed through trial and error over centuries, incorporated hard-won knowledge about how to build structures that could withstand enormous snow loads, powerful winds, and months of frozen conditions. When Gustav filed his homestead claim in the Tobacco Root Mountains in 1886, he immediately noticed that American frontier cabins were built nothing like Norwegian mountain buildings. The roofs were too shallow, typically pitched at 25 to 35 degrees. The roof structures were too light, using minimal timber with the goal of saving labor and material. The support systems were inadequate, relying on the strength of the ridge beam and wall plates without proper internal bracing. To Gustav's eye, trained in Norwegian methods, these cabins looked fragile, temporary, barely adequate for moderate conditions, and certain to fail under extreme stress. He decided to build differently. His cabin, constructed in the summer and fall of 1886, followed Norwegian principles adapted to Montana timber. The most striking feature, the one that immediately drew attention and mockery, was the roof. Gustav built his roof with a 60-degree pitch, 60 degrees from horizontal. For comparison, typical frontier cabin roofs were pitched at 25 to 35 degrees. A few exceptionally steep roofs might reach 40 degrees. Gustav's 60-degree roof was almost twice as steep as normal, nearly twice as steep as the steepest conventional roof in the region. When his few neighbors saw the roof taking shape, they were baffled. A trapper named Robert Hayes watched Gustav framework the steep rafters and finally asked, "Why so steep? You're using twice as much timber as you need. The roof's going to cost you double in materials and labor." "What's the point?" Gustav, working carefully to notch a rafter joint, replied, "The point is the roof will stand when snow comes. Shallow roofs hold snow. Snow is heavy, weight breaks roofs. Steep roofs shed snow. Snow slides off, no weight, no breaking." Hayes shook his head. "We get snow here, sure, 2-3 feet in a bad winter. That's not enough to break a decent roof. Your roof is designed for snow we never get." Gustav paused and looked at Hayes. "How long have you been in these mountains?" 5 years, Hayes answered. "And how long have my people been in Norwegian mountains?" Gustav asked. "I don't know. Hundreds of years." "Try 1,000 years, Gustav said. "We have seen every kind of winter, every kind of snow. We have buried ancestors who died when roofs collapsed. What you call a bad winter with 3 feet of snow, we call a light winter. When a real winter comes here, and it will come, your roof will break and mine will stand. We will see who wasted timber." Hayes left, unconvinced but slightly unsettled. The story spread. That Norwegian fellow was building a roof for snow that Montana never gets, wasting time and material on excessive construction. Some people thought Gustav was applying European solutions to American problems that didn't need those solutions. Others thought he simply didn't understand Montana conditions and was building for Norway when he should have been building for Montana. A few suspected he was just stubborn or foolish, following tradition without thinking about whether it made sense. No one seriously considered that Gustav might be right and everyone else might be dangerously wrong. The roof structure itself was as unconventional as its pitch. Gustav built with massive timbers, using logs that were 8 to 10 inches in diameter for his rafters. Conventional cabin roofs used 4 to 6-inch poles. Gustav's rafters were twice as thick, which meant they were roughly 4 times as strong in bending resistance. He spaced his rafters 16 inches on center, meaning there was only 16 inches between each pair of rafters. Conventional roofs often spaced rafters 24 or even 36 inches apart. Gustav's close spacing meant his roof had twice as many support members as typical construction. At the peak of the roof, Gustav installed a massive ridge beam, a single log 14 inches in diameter, hand-hewn flat on the top surface to accept the rafters. This ridge beam was supported every 6 feet by vertical posts that ran from the beam down to foundation-level floor joists. These posts, called king, Posts in Norwegian timber framing prevented the ridge from sagging under load. Conventional roofs relied on the ridge beam spanning unsupported between gable walls, and that span often sagged over time or failed catastrophically under extreme load. At the base of each rafter, where it met the wall plate, Gustav cut complex notches that locked the rafter in place. These weren't simple angled cuts. They were stepped notches with shoulders that resisted both downward force and outward thrust. In shallow pitched roofs, the outward thrust, the force trying to push the walls apart, is significant. In steep roofs, the downward force dominates. Gustav's notches were designed for vertical load transfer, keeping force moving straight down through the walls to the foundation, rather than trying to push walls outward. Every 6 rafters, Gustav installed collar ties, horizontal beams connecting pairs of rafters partway up their length. These collar ties prevented rafters from spreading under load and created triangulated structures that were far more rigid than rafters alone. The roof covering was another area where Gustav departed from convention. Most cabins used split shakes, thin wooden shingles split from cedar or pine logs. These shakes were light, quick to install, and adequate for moderate rain and snow. Gustav used shakes as his base layer, but he added 2 additional layers above them. Over the shakes, he laid a continuous layer of birch bark, overlapped and sealed with pine pitch. This created a waterproof membrane that prevented any moisture infiltration. Over the bark, he added a final layer of sod, 6 inches thick, held in place by wooden frames at the eaves. The sod provided insulation, thermal mass, and most importantly, additional weight that pinned the entire roof system down. In high winds, lightweight roofs could be lifted and torn off. Gustav's sod layer made the roof too heavy to lift. The wind would have to tear through the structural members themselves, not just overcome the weight of the covering. The total weight of Gustav's completed roof was enormous. The structural timbers, the thick rafters and massive ridge beam and collar ties weighed approximately 3 tons. The covering, shakes plus bark plus sod, weighed another 4 to 5 tons. Total roof weight was 7 to 8 tons, roughly 4 times heavier than a conventional cabin roof of similar size. This weight required substantial walls to support it. Gustav built his walls using vertical post construction rather than horizontal log stacking. He set massive posts at 4-foot intervals around the perimeter, each post 10 inches in diameter and buried 3 feet in the ground. Between these posts he filled with horizontal logs, chinked with moss and clay, but the load from the roof transferred to the posts, which carried it directly to the earth. This system could handle far more weight than typical log wall construction. By November of 1886, Gustav's cabin was complete. The structure looked bizarre. The roof dominated, rising steeply to a peak nearly 20 feet above the ground floor. The cabin looked like a huge tent made of logs and sod, a triangular mountain of a building rather than the low, horizontal profile of normal cabins. Visitors often commented on the cathedral-like interior, with the steep roof creating a tall, open space that seemed wasted since Gustav couldn't use it for anything. He just slept in a loft, partway up the steep roof slope, and used the rest as empty space. "What a waste," people said. "All that height, all that timber, and for what? For nothing useful." Gustav endured the comments without argument. He knew his roof would prove itself eventually. He just didn't know it would happen so dramatically or so soon. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was moderate. Snowfall was normal, perhaps 2 to 3 feet accumulated over the season. Gustav's steep roof shed snow continuously. After every storm, the snow would slide off the 60-degree pitch, leaving the roof nearly clean. Conventional roofs accumulated snow, building up thick layers that eventually compacted into dense, heavy packs. Gustav's roof carried almost no load because the snow never stayed on it. Neighbors noted this but didn't see it as particularly significant. Sure, the steep roof shed snow, but so what?
Their roofs held the snow without problems. What was the advantage of a roof that shed snow if roofs that held snow worked fine? The winter of 1887 to 1888 was heavier. Snowfall reached 4 feet accumulated. Some of the older cabins with aging roof timbers began showing stress. A few cabin owners had to knock snow off their roofs manually to prevent overload. Gustav's roof continued shedding snow automatically. No intervention needed. The snow slid off as it fell, accumulating on the ground around the cabin in huge berms, but never loading the roof structure. By late winter, Gustav's cabin sat in a depression, with walls of compacted snow 8 feet high surrounding it. But the roof itself was nearly clean, just a thin layer of fresh snow from the most recent storm. This pattern continued through 1889, 1890, and 1891. Each winter brought different snowfall amounts, but Gustav's roof always shed its load while conventional roofs accumulated weight. People began to admit that yes, Gustav's roof did shed snow effectively, but the cost in extra timber and labor still seemed excessive for a benefit that wasn't strictly necessary. Their roofs held up fine after all. Why overbuild? Then came March 1892. The storm hit with almost no warning. A sunny, relatively mild day on March 15th gave no indication of what was coming. By evening, clouds moved in. By midnight, snow was falling. By dawn on March 16th, the storm had intensified to blizzard conditions, and it kept intensifying. By midday, visibility was 0. Wind was screaming. Temperature had plummeted to 30 below, then 35 below, then 40 below. Snow fell at rates measured in inches per hour. This was not a normal storm. This was a meteorological event that occurs once per century, a convergence of conditions that produces snowfall and wind beyond anything in living memory. Gustav, inside his cabin, felt the structure shudder under wind gusts. He heard the wind howling around the steep roof, creating strange harmonic sounds as it accelerated up the angled surface. But the structure held firm. The massive timbers didn't creak or groan. The roof didn't sag or shift. The cabin felt solid, stable, secure. He couldn't see outside. The windows were completely covered by snow, driven horizontally against them by the wind. But inside, his fire burned steadily. His cabin was warm, and he was safe. He didn't know that less than 2 miles away, cabins were collapsing. That night, Robert Hayes's cabin roof failed. A central ridge beam spanning 14 feet unsupported between walls cracked under the snow load. The crack progressed rapidly from center toward the supports. Within seconds, the beam snapped completely. The roof folded inward, collapsing along the ridgeline. Hayes was sleeping in his loft when it happened. He felt the sudden drop, the sensation of falling, then crushing impact and darkness. He was buried under logs, shakes, and tons of snow. He died instantly, spine crushed by a falling rafter. 3 miles in another direction, a family of homesteaders huddled in their cabin as ominous sounds grew louder. The father, Eric Svensson, recognized the sounds of timber failing. He grabbed his wife and 2 children and moved them to the corner of the cabin farthest from the failing section. Seconds later, half the roof collapsed, burying the opposite corner under debris and snow. The family survived, but was trapped in a partially collapsed structure in 40 below temperatures during an ongoing blizzard. They had no way to signal for help, no way to escape, no way to rebuild shelter. They huddled together in the remaining corner, burning every piece of furniture they could reach for warmth, and waited for the storm to end. One by one over the next 2 days, they succumbed to hypothermia. All 4 died before the storm broke. Across the region, similar disasters unfolded. Roofs that had stood for 5, 10, even 15 years suddenly failed under unprecedented loads. The failure mechanism was usually the same. Snow accumulated on the shallow pitched roof. The weight compressed the snow into dense pack. More snow fell on top. Wind didn't clear the snow because the pitch was too shallow for wind to have much effect. The load grew and grew. Eventually, a critical structural member, usually the ridge beam or a major rafter, cracked. Once one member failed, the load redistributed to remaining members, overloading them. Progressive collapse followed. Within seconds, the entire roof system failed. Occupants had no warning and no chance to escape. Gustav, isolated in his cabin, knew nothing of these disasters. He endured the storm, keeping his fire fed, staying warm, and trusting his roof. On the third day, March 18th, the storm intensity finally began to decrease. By evening, the wind had dropped and the snow had slowed. By dawn of March 19th, the storm had passed. The sky cleared. The sun rose on a landscape buried under snow depths that seemed impossible. Gustav dug out his door, pushing through a drift that had reached above the door sill. He climbed out onto the surface of the snow, which was so compacted he could walk on it without breaking through. The world was white and silent, buried under 6 to 7 feet of snow on level ground. Drifts towered 20 feet high in places, and when Gustav looked across the valley toward where he knew his neighbor's cabins stood, he saw something that made his stomach clench: collapsed roofs. From his vantage point, he could see 3 cabins, all with caved-in roofs, logs and timbers jutting at odd angles through the snow. He immediately set out to check on neighbors, breaking trail through the deep snow, knowing that people might be trapped or injured. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. Of the 6 nearest cabins, 5 had collapsed. 3 occupants were dead. 2 had survived in partially collapsed structures but were suffering from frostbite and exposure. Gustav helped the survivors as best he could, bringing them to his intact cabin, feeding them, warming them, treating their injuries. Over the next few days, as more people dug out and assessed damage, the full scale of the disaster became clear. 17 cabins with roof failures, 8 dead, dozens injured, property damage that would take years to repair, and 6 cabins intact. Gustav's was one of those 6. The survivors gathered at Gustav's cabin, the largest undamaged structure in the area, and asked the question that everyone needed answered. How did his roof survive when so many others failed? Gustav walked them through his design: the 60-degree pitch that shed snow continuously, the massive structural timbers that could support enormous loads, the close rafter spacing that distributed load evenly, the king posts that prevented ridge sag, the complex notches that transferred forces properly, the heavy sod layer that pinned everything down against wind. Every element had a purpose. Every choice had a reason. He'd built based on 1,000 years of Norwegian experience with extreme winter conditions. He'd built for the worst possible storm, not the worst storm anyone had seen recently. A man named John Peterson, whose cabin had partially collapsed and whose brother had died in a total collapse, listened to Gustav's explanation and finally understood. We built for 3 feet of snow because that's the most we'd seen. You built for 8 feet of snow because that's what you knew was possible. We built for the winters we'd experienced. You built for the winters that exist. Gustav nodded. In Norway, we have a saying: build for the grandmother winter, not for the mother winter or the daughter winter. Build for the old woman who has seen everything and who will come back someday. Your grandmother winter came. My roof was ready. If you're learning about building techniques and historical knowledge that could still save lives today, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore forgotten innovations and techniques that solved real problems. Knowledge that's been lost but shouldn't be. Your subscription helps us continue this work. Now let's explore the engineering principles that made Gustav's roof succeed where others failed. The physics of roof failure under snow load involves several interconnected factors: structural capacity, load distribution, material behavior under stress, and the difference between static and dynamic loading. First, snow load calculation. Snow weight varies depending on density. Fresh powder snow weighs approximately 5 to 10 pounds per cubic foot. Settled snow weighs 15 to 20 pounds per cubic foot. Wet, compacted snow weighs 30 to 40 pounds per cubic foot. Ice weighs approximately 57 pounds per cubic foot. During the Great Whiteout, 8 feet of snow accumulated. In sheltered areas like rooftops, this snow compacted under its own weight. A reasonable estimate is that the bottom 2 feet compacted to approximately 30 pounds per cubic foot, the middle 4 feet averaged 20 pounds per cubic foot, and the top 2 feet remained at 10 pounds per cubic foot. Total load equals 2 feet times 30 pounds plus 4 feet times 20 pounds plus 2 feet times 10 pounds equals 60 plus 80 plus 20 equals 160 pounds per square foot. For a cabin with a roof measuring 20 feet by 30 feet, the roof area in plan view is 600 square feet. Total snow load is 160 times 600 equals 96,000 pounds, or 48 tons. 48 tons of snow sitting on a roof structure designed to hold perhaps 5 to 10 tons maximum. Conventional roof structures couldn't handle this load. The critical component in most failures was the ridge beam. A typical ridge beam might be a log 8 inches in diameter, spanning 14 to 16 feet between gable wall supports. This beam had to support half the roof load, approximately 24 tons. The bending stress in the beam can be calculated using standard formulas. For a uniformly loaded beam, maximum bending stress equals load times length squared, divided by beam section modulus. An 8-inch diameter log has a section modulus of approximately 50 cubic inches. With 24 tons, 48,000 pounds, over a 14-foot span, 168 inches, the maximum stress is approximately 48,000 times 168 squared divided by 50 equals approximately 2.7 million inch-pounds, divided by 50 equals approximately 54,000 pounds per square inch. Wood has a bending strength of approximately 5,000 to 8,000 pounds per square inch depending on species and condition. The beam is being stressed to roughly 10 times its capacity. It fails catastrophically, snapping near the center where bending stress is highest. Gustav's ridge beam, in contrast, was 14 inches in diameter and was supported every 6 feet by king posts. The larger diameter gave it a section modulus of approximately 270 cubic inches, more than 5 times larger than the conventional beam. The short 6-foot spans between supports meant each span carried only a fraction of the total load. Even under extreme load, Gustav's ridge beam experienced stress well within the safe working limits of the wood. It didn't crack, didn't sag, didn't fail. Second factor, load shedding versus load accumulation. The critical difference between Gustav's 60-degree roof and conventional 30-degree roofs was the angle of repose of snow. Snow will slide off a surface when the gravitational force pulling it down slope exceeds the friction force holding it in place. The critical angle depends on snow type and surface material. For dry snow on smooth wood, the critical angle is approximately 35 to 45 degrees. For wet, sticky snow, it might be 50 to 60 degrees. Gustav's 60-degree pitch exceeded the critical angle even for wet, sticky snow. Any snow that accumulated would slide off as soon as the layer became thick enough to overcome surface friction. The sliding was continuous and automatic. Conventional roofs at 30 degrees were below the critical angle. Snow accumulated indefinitely, building up layers that compacted and stayed in place. The longer the storm, the more snow accumulated, the heavier the load became. With a 4-day storm producing 8 feet of total snowfall and no load shedding occurring, the full weight of that 8 feet remained on the roof. Gustav's roof, shedding continuously, never accumulated more than a few inches before the layer slid off. His maximum load was perhaps 10 to 15 pounds per square foot, less than 10% of the load on conventional roofs. This difference meant Gustav's roof was always operating well within its capacity, while conventional roofs were being loaded to failure. Third factor, structural redundancy and load paths. Gustav's roof had multiple redundant load paths. If one rafter developed a crack, The load could redistribute to adjacent rafters through the close spacing and collar tie connections. The 16-inch spacing meant each rafter carried only a small portion of the total load. Even if several rafters failed, the remaining rafters could handle the redistributed load. Conventional roofs with 24 or 36-inch spacing had fewer load paths. Each rafter carried a larger portion of the load. If one rafter failed, the sudden load redistribution could trigger progressive collapse. Additionally, Gustav's king posts supporting the ridge beam created internal load paths that took weight directly to the foundation. This prevented the ridge from sagging, which would have increased stress on rafters and created instability. Conventional roofs lacked these internal supports, relying entirely on the spanning capacity of the ridge beam. Fourth factor, wind effects and aerodynamics. High winds interacting with snow-loaded roofs create complex forces. Wind can create uplift on shallow-pitched roofs, literally trying to lift the roof off the structure. It can also create uneven loading, blowing snow into drifts that overload specific areas. Gustav's steep pitch created different aerodynamics. Wind hitting the windward slope was deflected upward, accelerating as it went. This acceleration created a boundary layer effect that actually helped strip snow from the roof. The steep angle also meant wind couldn't create significant uplift. The aerodynamic forces reinforced the structural design, helping shed snow rather than accumulating it or threatening to rip the roof off. The sod layer on Gustav's roof had a specific purpose beyond insulation. The weight of the sod, approximately 30 to 40 pounds per square foot, created a massive downward force that resisted wind uplift. During the storm, winds of 70 to 80 miles per hour created uplift forces on roofs estimated at 50 to 60 pounds per square foot. Lightweight roofs with only shakes, weighing perhaps 5 to 10 pounds per square foot, were at risk of being torn off. Gustav's sod-covered roof weighed 5 to 6 times more, making uplift impossible. The fifth factor was timber quality and seasoning. Gustav had cut his roof timbers in fall and let them season through the following winter and spring before construction. Seasoned wood is stronger and more stable than green wood. The moisture content of properly seasoned wood is around 15 to 20% compared to 40 to 60% for green wood. Lower moisture content means higher strength, less tendency to warp or crack, and better long-term performance. Many frontier builders used green timber because seasoning took time they didn't want to invest. Gustav's patience in using properly seasoned timber paid dividends in structural reliability. The mathematical analysis of structural capacity versus load shows why conventional roofs failed. A typical cabin roof with 8-inch ridge beam, 6-inch rafters at 24-inch spacing, spanning 16 by 20 feet, had a safe working capacity of approximately 12 to 15 tons. Under the Great Whiteout snow load, the actual load was 40 to 50 tons. Load-to-capacity ratio was 3 to 4 to 1. Failure was inevitable. Gustav's roof, with 14-inch ridge beams supported every 6 feet, 10-inch rafters at 16-inch spacing, same cabin size, had a safe working capacity of approximately 60 to 70 tons. His load, because the roof shed snow continuously, never exceeded 5 tons. Load-to-capacity ratio was less than 0.1 to 1. Failure was impossible. The safety factor difference between conventional roofs. Safety factor less than 0.5, meaning overloaded and certain to fail. And Gustav's roof, safety factor greater than 10, meaning massive reserve capacity, was the difference between catastrophic collapse and complete survival. After the Great Whiteout, survivors wanted to rebuild. Many asked Gustav to help them design new roofs. Gustav agreed, and over the following 2 years, he personally built or supervised the construction of 18 new cabin roofs in the Tobacco Root region. Each one incorporated the principles he'd used on his own cabin: steep pitch, typically 55 to 65 degrees, massive structural timbers properly sized for extreme loads, close rafter spacing for load distribution, king post support systems for ridge beams, proper load transfer through notched connections, multiple roof covering layers, including sod or heavy shakes. These rebuilt cabins would face many subsequent winters, some severe, none as extreme as the Great Whiteout. Every one of these Gustav-designed roofs remained standing through decades of use. Some are still standing today, more than a century later, testament to the quality of the design. The spread of steep roof design beyond Gustav's immediate area was slower than might be expected. Several factors limited adoption. First, steep roofs required approximately twice as much timber as shallow roofs. In regions where timber was scarce or required significant effort to harvest, this cost was prohibitive. Second, steep roofs required more skilled carpentry. The complex notches, the proper angles, the structural calculations, these weren't techniques every builder possessed. Third, the Great Whiteout was recognized as an extreme event. Many builders assumed it was a once-per-century occurrence, and that building for such extremes was unnecessary. They built for typical winters, accepting that occasionally an extreme event might cause damage. This calculated risk made economic sense to people with limited resources. Fourth, cultural inertia favored familiar designs. Shallow pitched roofs were the American frontier standard. Steep pitched roofs looked foreign, Norwegian or Swiss or something other than American. Many builders preferred to stick with what they knew even when shown evidence that other approaches worked better. Despite these barriers, steep roof design did spread gradually through regions with heavy snowfall. By the early 1900s, cabins in high snowfall areas increasingly featured steeper pitches, stronger framing, and better load management. The knowledge Gustav brought from Norway, validated tragically by the Great Whiteout, was slowly being absorbed into American mountain building practice. Gustav himself continued living in his cabin until 1908, when he sold his trap line and moved to Butte, Montana. He worked as a carpenter and building consultant, specializing in roof design for heavy snow loads. He built barns, mining structures, and homes throughout the region, always emphasizing adequate structural capacity and proper snow management. He died in 1923 at age 69. His original cabin stood until the 1950s, when it was finally demolished. But the roof remained structurally sound to the very end, nearly 70 years after construction. Modern building codes now specify minimum snow loads and structural requirements for roofs in different regions. These codes are based on statistical analysis of snowfall records and engineering calculations of required capacity. In Montana, design snow loads range from 30 to 70 pounds per square foot, depending on location. Gustav's roof, if evaluated by modern codes, would meet or exceed requirements for the most severe snow load zones. He was building to modern standards in 1886, using empirical knowledge developed over centuries in Norway. The principles Gustav demonstrated remain relevant today. First, design for extreme events, not typical events. The structure must survive the worst case, not just the average case. This requires understanding what worst case actually means, which requires either long historical records or learning from regions with more experience with extreme conditions. Second, load shedding is superior to load bearing for snow management. A steep roof that sheds snow operates at low stress continuously. A shallow roof that holds snow must be built strong enough for maximum possible accumulation, which requires enormous structural capacity. The steep roof is more efficient because it prevents the problem rather than resisting it. Third, structural redundancy and proper load paths prevent progressive collapse. Multiple load-bearing members, short spans, internal supports, these create systems that are robust against single-point failures. Fourth, quality materials, and proper seasoning matter more than most builders realize. The difference between marginal timber and good timber can be the difference between failure and survival under extreme load. Fifth, knowledge from other regions and other cultures can be directly applicable if the underlying conditions are similar. Gustav's Norwegian knowledge applied perfectly to Montana because both regions have cold winters, heavy snow, and similar building materials available. Ignoring that knowledge because it's foreign is foolish. The practical barrier to adopting steep roof design today is primarily cost. Steep roofs require more material and more skilled labor. In modern construction, this translates to higher initial cost, often 20 to 40% higher than conventional roof framing. Homeowners and builders optimizing for minimum first cost will choose conventional design, but the lifetime cost calculation favors steep roofs in high snow areas. Roof failures are expensive, dangerous, and potentially fatal. A properly designed steep roof will outlast multiple conventional roofs and will never require emergency snow removal or structural reinforcement. Over a 50-year building life, the steep roof is likely cheaper when all costs are considered. Before we conclude, I want to ask one more time. If you found value in this story, if you're thinking about building, design, and risk in a new way, please subscribe to this channel right now, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community, learning from historical innovations. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you. The Great Whiteout of March 1892 was a tragedy that killed 8 people and destroyed dozens of structures. It was also a harsh teacher that forced survivors to recognize their assumptions about building design were dangerously inadequate. The cabins that failed had been built by experienced frontier builders using accepted methods that had worked for years or even decades. But working for years proves nothing if you haven't encountered the extreme conditions that test your design. Gustav's cabin, built based on centuries of Norwegian experience, was designed for conditions more severe than anyone in Montana had seen in the 50 years since settlement. When those conditions arrived, his design succeeded and conventional designs failed. The lesson should have been learned permanently, but human nature resists learning from extreme events. Within 20 years of the Great Whiteout, new cabins were being built with shallow roofs again because the extreme storm hadn't repeated, and people convinced themselves it was a freak event that wouldn't happen again. They were wrong, of course. Extreme events are rare by definition, but they do recur. The question is whether your structure will survive when they come. Gustav's steep roof answered that question definitively. It survived the worst storm of the 19th century in Montana with 0 damage. That's the standard all roofs should meet. Whether they do or not is a choice every builder makes. Thank you for watching this story about Gustav Nordstrom and his slanted roof design. If this changed how you think about building, risk management, or learning from other cultures, please share it with someone who might benefit. And remember that what looks excessive or wasteful might actually be the only adequate approach. The roof everyone mocked as too steep was the only roof that survived. The timber everyone said was wasted saved lives. Sometimes excess is wisdom. Sometimes waste is investment. Sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only one who sees clearly. Gustav built for grandmother winter when everyone else built for daughter winter. Grandmother came, Gustav's roof stood, others fell. Build for grandmother, build for the worst, build to survive. That's the lesson from the Great Whiteout, carved in snow and written in the lives saved by one man's unwillingness to build conventionally when convention was inadequate. 60 degrees might look excessive, but 44 below zero and 8 feet of snow don't care what looks normal. They care what works. Gustav's roof worked. That's all that matters.